Good morning, everyone. I am Christine Joy A. Asharto, and I'm going to continue and discuss the last stage of moral development, which is the sixth and highest stage of moral development. This stage exists even beyond the fifth stage of the social contract, choosing to act in accordance with universal ethical principle that one has personally determined. One realizes that all the conventions, laws, rules, and regulations of society are only correct if they are based on these universal ethical principles. They must be followed only if they are reflect an universal ethical principle. This is for Kohlberg the full maturity of post-conventional thinking, since this stage recognizes that in the end, the questions of what one to do goes back to the individual moral agent and her own rationality towards the goal of getting things right. Kohlberg's insight is that ultimately one must think for herself what she ought to do. This stand recognizes the supposed fact that there might be instances when she or the agent must choose to go against what community of rational thinkers judge as good if she really thinks she must, assuming that she already committed her full rationality in getting to the point or at that situation. Well, of course, we don't have to accept completely the Kohlberg's theory about moral development to see its overall values. This theory helped us, at the very last, to point out the differences of moral reasoning. Well, the more mature kind is seen in people who are not anymore dictated by the logic of reward and punishment or the pain and pleasure. Simply following the rules, even if theoretically they are the correct ones, does not necessarily qualify as morally matured behavior. One must make free use of her or his own power of reasoning in cases of moral choices, and not remain creature of blind obedience to either pain and pleasure or the demands of the group if one aspires to moral maturity. The significance of the studying the different ethical theories and frameworks becomes clear only to the individual who has achieved or is in the process of achieving moral maturity. And for someone who are still in Kohlberg's pre-conventional or conventional stages, for them, moral valuation remains a matter of seeking reward or avoiding punishment, or at the best, a question of following the dictates of the people. For one is well on the way to the moral maturity, the task using one's reason to understand moral issues become a real possibility and authentic responsibility. Part of this maturity is also the realization that ethical thinking is not a completely intellectual task, but one that also involves the feelings. Now, in the next section, we shall have a brief treatment of the rule of emotions and feelings in a moral deliberation. Armed with a clarification, let us afterward turn the challenge of making sense of moral problems. Now let's proceed to feelings in moral deliberation. Emotion processes contribute to moral judgment by assigning affective value to the moral decision-making scenarios, thus guiding the distinction between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. When we say emotion, that is to say feelings or intuition, these emotions play a major role in most of ethical decisions people make. Most people do not realize how much their emotions direct to their moral choices, but experts think it is impossible for us to make an important moral judgment without emotion involved. Emotions or feelings have long been derided purely rationalistic perspective as having no place in properly executive moral decision. However, this prejudice needs to be examined thoroughly, although some emotions or feelings can derail one from a clear-minded decision in an ethical situation. But it is also not possible that for a human choice can be purged of all feelings, since after all, a moral agent is neither robot nor computer. They are all human. A more realistic attitude toward decision making is to appreciate the indispensable role emotions have on an agent acts of choosing. Decision influenced by emotions by the level of thought. Emotions not only affect the content of cognition but also the level of information processing that goes into making conclusion. Let us now discuss the view of one of the famous Greek philosopher, Aristotle. According to him, emotions are an original and integral part of ethics. Emotions are an inherent part of our moral reasoning and being, and therefore they should be an inherent part of any moral deliberation. Based on Aristotle's view, we examine 5 specific aspects of emotion: the description of emotion, the attitude towards emotion, the thoughts present in emotions, and the reliability of emotions, and the last one is the reasonable principle that guides an emotion. Aristotle precisely points out that moral virtue goes beyond the mere act of intellectually and identifying the right thing to do. Instead, it is the condition of one's character by which the agent is able to manage her emotions or feelings. Note that Aristotle does not say remove all the feelings. Instead, he says that cultivating one or characters lies in learning to manage one's feelings. And another thing is, a responsible moral agent, then a supposedly dispassionate or not affected by moral decision maker is an unrealistic ideal. The passion or feelings do not necessarily detract from making an informed moral decision. One can even argue that making a moral decision sincere, it is all about what she values. It involves her feelings so that they do not remain in the pre-conventional level, that is, of self-centered feelings, reducible or to draw them together to individualistic notions of pleasure and pain. The morally developed or matured individual or agent therefore must have honed her intellectual capacity to determine the relevant elements in a moral situation, including the moral principle to explore. On the top of that, she must also have cultivated her feelings so that she neither simply give in to childish emotion nor does she also dismiss the right feelings required for a truly informed moral decision. The matured moral agent realizes that she is both a product of many forces, elements, and events, of all which shape her situation and options for a decision. She also realizes that she is not merely a puppet of external causes, and instead, a meaningful moral decision is one that makes in full cognizance of where she or he is coming from and where he ought to go. And now that we are already aware of how our feelings affects our moral decisions, at this point we are ready to identify the steps in making informed moral decision. But before that, let's first discuss what a moral problem is. A moral problem is a situation in which a person has two moral obligations which cannot be met both at once. Behind this obligation lie a conflicting values. What must morally matured individual do when she or he is confronted with moral problems? First, in order to answer these questions, first we must understand that there are different types of moral problems, each one requiring a particular set of rational deliberations or act of deciding carefully. And after that, after understanding the different types of moral deliberation, we proceed in attempting to construct an outline of what we ought to do when confronted with potential ethics issues. Here are the steps that should be followed when we encounter potential ethical problems. First, we ought to think if there is a potential ethical issue is to determine our level of involvement in the case at hand. Do we need to make a moral decision in a situation that needs action on our part? Or are we trying to determine the right thing to do in a particular situation being discussed? In a latter situation, we may be making a moral judgment on a particular case, but one does not necessarily involve ourselves. Well, for instance, when we read a case that involves other people and we have nothing to do with it, that case, but still we made a moral judgment, or while watching news and a television. And of course, in any ethics class like ours, students are made to imagine what they would do in a particular situation. Moral imagination is being exercised in the hope of cultivating moral reasoning and giving directions to the needed cultivation of their feelings through habits. But students must be able to distinguish between making judgment on a particular ethical situation and coming up with a morally responsible decision for situations that are actually a part of. Being a moral agent, they especially refer to the latter situation, which is making moral judgment even in the case that they have nothing to do or they have nothing involved with. Therefore, we must identify which activity we are engaged in, whether we are making a judgment on a case that we are not involved, or if we truly need make a decision in a situation that demands that we act. And after determining our level of involvement in a potential moral problem, let's now proceed to the second step. We need to make sure of the facts. And the first fact that we need to establish is whether we are faced with a moral situation or not. Let's check if we really confronted with genuinely moral situation or that the merely involves a judgment in the level of aesthetics or of etiquette. But if the situation we are involved in truly has a moral weight, if it strikes one to the core since it involves what truly means to be human, then we must now establish all the facts that might have bearing on our decision. We must set aside all the details that have no or it doesn't have connection to the situation. And now, after that, the second one, we must also identify whether an item in consideration is truly factual or mere hearsay, anecdotal, or an unfounded assumption, and thus unsupportable. Since this is where such things like fake news and alternative facts have to be weeded or removed. Letting such details seep into our ethical deliberation may unfairly determine or shape our ethical decision-making process, leading us into a potential baseless choice or conclusion. The responsible moral individual must make sure that she possesses all the facts she needs for that particular situation, but also the facts that she only needs. No more, no less. And now, after checking if we're really confronted with moral situation, let's proceed to the third step, which is identify all the people who may potentially be affected by the implication of moral situation or by our concrete choice of action. And these people are called the stakeholders. Identifying these stakeholders forces us to give consideration to people aside from ourselves. The psychological tendency most of us, when confronted with an ethical choice, is simply think of ourselves and what we need or what we want. This is also where we can be trapped in a matured assumption that the only thing is what we feel at the moment, which usually reducible to Kohlberg's notion of pre-conventional think. This is what we have mentioned before. When the time that we identify all the stakeholders, we oblige to recognize all the other people potentially concerned with the ethical problem at hand. And thus, we must think of a reason aside from our own self-serving ones to come up with a conclusion that are impartial in the sense of that they take consideration of everyone's welfare, though still thoroughly involved. Therefore, don't be selfish into making your conclusion. And aside from identifying the stakeholders, we must also determine how they may be affected by whichever choice the agent makes in the given ethical situation, as well as to what degree. Not all stakeholders have an equal stake in a given moral case. Some be more favorable or more adversely affected by a particular conclusion or choice compared to others. A person's awareness of these probabilities is necessarily to gain more comprehensive assessment of the matter at hand in order to arrive at hopefully stronger reasons for making a definite ethical conclusion or choice. After establishing the facts and identifying the stakeholders and their concern in the matter, we must now identify the ethical issue at hand. There are several types of ethical problems or issues. And the first one is a situation which we need to clarify whether a certain action is morally right or morally wrong. And this is where the different ethical theories or framework can serve. And the second type is determining whether a particular action in a question can be identified with a generally accepted ethical or unethical action. For instance, the issue of the ethical value of the death penalty. Can we say that death penalty is equivalent to murder? Murder is considered one of the worst acts a human being can perform. For instance, the issue of legalizing the death penalty is precisely an ethical issue or a question, since for some people, the act of which a state executes someone guilty of heinous crime should not be considered an act of murder, which is clearly wrong. The ethical debate surrounding the imposition of the death penalty is generally not about whether some acts of murder are justifiable or not. Rather, whether legally sanctioned execution ought to be considered as murder or not. And the third type points to the presence of an ethical dilemma. Dilemma or ethical situation which there are competing values that seems to have equal worth. The problem can be concerned either with a choice between two competing moral goods or between two evils. Therefore, the responsible moral individual must be able to recognize what exactly the ethical issue at hand is and formulate and state it clearly as a moral problem. And she has to identify the fundamental values at conflict. In such situation, in order to assess later if a workable solution to the ethical problem can be negotiated that will somehow not end up surrendering one value for the sake of another. The individual must try to find the best balance possible that may honor the competing values. And then she must identify the possible choices in a given ethical situation and weigh which one among them can best meet the interests of all stakeholders in question. The individual must therefore identify the probable consequence that a particular choice of action, if it will bring to the stakeholders concerned in order to determine which choice possibly is the best, given the situation. For instance, the popular scene of Robin Hood or scenario usually put in the question, is it right to steal from the rich in order to feed the poor? What one is confronted here is a situation in which two competing values are in conflict with one another. And finally, we're at the final step. And of course, it is for individual to make her ethical conclusion or decision, whether in judging what ought to be done in a given case or in coming up with a concrete action she must actually perform. The real ethical decisions are more often very difficult enough to make and for so many different reasons. Not all the facts in a given case may be available to the agent for her consideration. Some facts may eventually turn out to be misleading or not true at all. And additionally, it is extremely demanding to account for all the stakeholders concerned as well as the identify and extent of their interest in a particular case. Many people tend to underestimate the value of the human rights of criminals, and therefore the difficulty of identifying all the values at play in a given ethical issue. The moral agent must be able to learn how to avoid the seduction of surrendering to blind supplication. It is much easier to turn blind eye to other values that one does not want to consider in a situation for whatever the reason. The responsible moral individual must forge on realizing full well that cultivating one's capacity for matured moral choice is continuing journey in her life. And again, let's go back to Aristotle. He recognizes the importance of continuous habituation and the goal of shaping one's character so that she becomes more used to choosing the right thing. And moral individual is always a human being whose intellect remains finite and whose passions remain dynamic and who is always placed in a situation that are unique. There are no automatic moral decisions. Therefore, such praise like patently paradoxical, one must continue to manage her reason and passions to respond in the best way possible to the kaleidoscope of moral situation that she finds herself in. And that's all for my discussion. Hope you learned something. And now let me give the virtual floor to the next presenter. Thank you.